Imagine standing on a battlefield in the year 1514, specifically the plains of Chaldiran.
Right.
On one side, you have tens of thousands of elite, heavily armed cavalrymen who don't just respect their king, right? They literally believe he is a living god.
Yeah, this is intense fanaticism.
Exactly. They believe his sheer presence makes them invincible. And then on the other side, you have the thundering, massive cannons of the dawn of the gunpowder age.
Oh, it's brutal.
It is. When those two forces collide, it doesn't just, destroy an army. It absolutely shatters the psychology of an entire empire. Welcome to the deep dive.
It's the ultimate collision between ideology and reality. And, that collision is exactly why we are so fascinated by the stack of sources you, the listener, sent over for us to explore today.
We are so thrilled you're joining us because this is a highly unusual, deeply customized exploration of your notes. What you've handed us is a hybrid. It's completely fascinating.
Yeah, it really is.
Half of this material is a rigorous, granular historical analysis of the Safavid Empire, which ruled Iran from 1501 to 1722. But the other half is a psychological profile.
Which is such a wild combination.
Right. You've asked us to map this massive early modern global power to a very specific personality concept that you call Devon.
Which is such a compelling lens. We aren't just tracing the borders of a dead empire here. We are conducting a psychological autopsy of a state.
For those of you listening who don't have these notes right in front of you, let me explain this Devon framework. In your notes, Devon represents a distinct psychological profile. We're talking stoicism, intense discipline, and a preference for rigid structure that is forged directly through pain and failure.
Yeah, it's about the dangerous edge of using absolute control as a mechanism for survival.
Exactly. Devon is about building strength through damage, taking past trauma, and instead of healing it, weaponizing it into highly calculated action. And you want us to view the Safavids through that exact mirror.
And our mission today is to do exactly that. We are going to extract the core mechanisms, like the actual day-to-day levers of power, of how the Safavids manufactured their identity, how they sustained their global influence, and, ultimately how they collapsed.
Right.
We are going to use this Devon framework to really understand the double-edged sword of absolute discipline. What happens when a personality built on control and conviction scales outward to become an entire civilization?
Okay, let's unpack this, because looking at your notes, the very first thing we have to do is completely throw out our standard inherited definition of what an empire even is.
Oh, 100%.
If we try to view the Safavids through the lens of, say, the British or the Spanish, the whole thing just falls apart.
It falls apart because our default setting for the word empire is inherently maritime and colonial. When we think of the 1500s and 1600s, we automatically picture wooden galleons crossing the Atlantic.
Right, planting flags and all that.
Exactly. We picture planting flags on distant shores, establishing settler colonies, and extracting resources from across an ocean. That is the European model.
But the Safavids didn't have an armada. They weren't sailing off to the Americas.
Right. The Safavids were an early, modern, land-based empire. Their mechanics of power were entirely different. They projected global influence not by conquering overseas territories, but by locking down a contiguous, just massive landmass.
Yeah.
They dominated the incredibly lucrative silk trade, they manufactured a powerful state religion, and they held iron-fisted control over the crucial overland caravan routes and the ports of the Persian Gulf. They didn't need to cross oceans because, well, they controlled the very center of the map.
Which brings us to the geography, because before we can talk about the psychology of the people running this empire, we have to look at the literal physical board they were playing on.
It's vital context.
Your notes detail their core zones. You've got the Iranian plateau, Azerbaijan, Fars, and these harsh, massive mountain ranges like the Zagros. And looking at the map, it is not an easy place to build a centralized state.
No, it's historically one of the most difficult regions to unify. You have these immense deserts in the center, encircled by rugged, towering mountain ranges. It naturally fractures people into isolated pockets.
Right, it's just physically dividing everyone.
Exactly. But at the same time, its geopolitical location is priceless.
The way the sources describe it, I couldn't help but picture Iran as the ultimate toll booth on the highway of Eurasia. It's this massive commercial hinge.
That's a great way to look at it.
You have silk-producing regions in the north, and these transit corridors connecting India, Central Asia, the Ottoman lands, and Europe. They didn't need a navy because the wealth of the world had to literally walk right through their front door on the backs of camels and mules.
But being the toll booth comes with a terrifying vulnerability. You have to understand the geopolitical reality of the 16th century here. If you sit in the middle of all that wealth, everyone wants to take your seat.
Yeah, you're a target.
A huge target. You are sitting squarely between major, highly aggressive rivals. To your west, you have the Ottoman Empire, which is a massive, expanding Sunni power armed to the teeth.
Right.
And to your east and northeast, you have the Uzbek confederations constantly raiding your borders.
It's a geographic pressure cooker. You're just completely surrounded.
Surrounded with highly porous borders that are nearly impossible to defend everywhere at once.
Yeah.
This wasn't a passive existence.
Yeah.
I mean, it guaranteed a state of constant existential frontier warfare.
I want you, listening right now, to put yourself in that exact position. Think about what that does to a human mind or, to a state apparatus.
Right.
If you are surrounded by lethal threats on all sides, and internally you have a fractured, difficult terrain, you cannot afford to be passive. You cannot afford to be tolerant of dissent. You either develop an intense, uncompromising internal discipline, or you are crushed. There is no middle ground.
Not at all.
And right there, we see the origin story of the Devon personality in these notes. The trauma of the environment necessitates absolute control.
It's the foundational trauma of the state. A harsh, unforgiving environment requires a harsh, uncompromising founder. Which brings us to a really fascinating figure who steps into this fractured, bleeding landscape.
Right. Shah Ismail, the year is 1501. The sources say he is the one who unified Iran after centuries of fragmentation. But I'm reading the mechanics of how he did this, and I have to push back on our modern idea of what a king is.
Yeah, he's not your standard monarch.
Because Ismail does not fit the mold of a guy sitting in a castle collecting taxes.
Not at all. How did the notes strike you on this?
It read less like a royal succession and more like the rise of a highly volatile militant cult leader.
Yeah.
He didn't start as a traditional prince. He was the head of a mystical Sufi order based in a city called Ardabil. He fused radical religious mysticism with kingship. It wasn't just, pay your taxes and obey the law. It was, I am the shadow of God on earth.
Exactly.
His followers didn't just fight for him, they actively worshipped him.
This is a crucial mechanism of early Safavid power. You have to understand that in 1501, Ismail was only a teenager.
Which is wild.
It is.
Yeah.
He leveraged this messianic aura to rapidly conquer territory.
Yeah.
There was no separation of church and state. They were perfectly, intensely overlapping circles. It was ideological intensity dialed to the absolute maximum.
But the defining moment for Ismail, the act that actually forged the identity of Iran as we know it, was a massive calculated risk.
Yeah.
He imposes Twelver Shiʻism as the official state religion of his new empire.
Right.
Now, taking theology out of it and just looking at the sheer political mechanics, why do that? The majority of the population he just conquered was Sunni.
Wow.
Why alienate your own people?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is one of the most brilliant and brutal geopolitical maneuvers in history. Yes, it was violent. Yes, he forced conversions at sword point. But politically, he needed a civilizational boundary.
The wall.
Precisely. If his people remained Sunni, they could easily be absorbed by the massive Sunni Ottoman Empire right next door. By violently enforcing Twelver Shiʻism, Ismail created an impenetrable ideological wall.
That makes so much sense.
He essentially told his people, we are fundamentally different from them, they are the enemy. It forged an exclusive, highly cohesive Iranian identity that simply did not exist before.
But the notes highlight a dangerous side effect. When states define themselves through absolute truth claims, compromise becomes impossible.
Yeah, you lose all flexibility.
Exactly. You can negotiate over a river or a mountain range. You cannot negotiate over absolute divine truth. It turned a territorial dispute with the Ottomans into an apocalyptic sectarian war.
And to fight that war, Ismail needed a very specific type of weapon. He couldn't rely on peasant levies. He relied on the Quizzlebash.
Okay, let's get into the Quizzlebash, because they seem to be the engine of this early empire. Who exactly were they, and why were they fighting for a teenage mystic?
The Quizzlebash, which translates to redheads because of the distinctive red headgear they wore, were confederations of Turkic tribal warriors. They were fierce, highly mobile cavalrymen from regions like Anatolia and the Caucasus.
Okay.
They were drawn to Ismail's messianic claims. They became his elite shock troops. The mechanism here is simple. Ismail provides the divine legitimacy, and the Quizzlebash provide the monopoly on violence.
But wait, looking at these notes, that sounds like a massive structural flaw.
Oh, it is.
If you are the Shah and your entire military power is outsourced to a group of tribal warlords who are loyal to their own chiefs, Aren't you essentially a hostage to your own army?
You've just identified the central paradox of early Safavid history.
Oh.
It is the classic trap of the kingmaker. The sword that builds the throne eventually demands to sit on it. The Qizilbash were rewarded with vast tracts of land and provincial governorships. Over time, they became factional, volatile, and incredibly powerful. They limited the central control of the Shah because they held the actual military power in the provinces.
So as long as Ismail was winning, as long as he seems like an invincible god on earth, they fell in line.
Right.
But that illusion of invincibility has an expiration date. Which brings us back to that visceral scene we started with, 1514, the Battle of Chaldiran.
The psychological shatterpoint of the empire.
Ismail leads his fiercely loyal, religiously motivated Qizilbash cavalry against the Ottoman army, but the Ottomans bring something the Safavids had never seriously faced: massed artillery, matchlock muskets, gunpowder.
We have to understand the mechanics of this defeat. The Qizilbash charged with terrifying bravery, relying on traditional cavalry tactics. The Ottomans literally chained their cannons together to break the cavalry charges and just decimated them. It was a slaughter.
And it wasn't just a loss of territory, though they lost heavily in Anatolia. It was the death of an idea. The myth of Shah Ismail's divine invincibility is blown to pieces by Ottoman cannons. The sources say Ismail was so traumatized he basically withdrew into mourning and drinking. He never led an army into battle again.
So Chaldiran proves that religious zeal shatters against gunpowder. The Safavids are bleeding territory, their founding myth is dead, and over the next few decades, the Qizilbash tribes begin fracturing the state from the inside, fighting each other for control. The empire is literally dying.
To survive, the state doesn't need another prophet. It needs a mechanic, someone to completely rebuild the engine. And that's what triggers the rise of Shah Abbas I. He takes the throne in 1588.
If Ismail was the chaotic, volatile startup founder who ran the company on pure charisma, Shah Abbas is the ruthless, highly effective CEO who is brought in by the board to corporatize the system.
That's a great way to put it, but I want to understand the how. Your notes call him the empire's greatest ruler. He inherits an empire that is fractured, economically strained, and militarily outdated. How exactly does a 17-year-old kid, which is how old he was when he took power, fix that?
He does it by methodically bypassing the old systems. Think of it like rewiring a house that's about to catch fire. The old wiring was the Qizilbash. They controlled the provinces, kept the tax revenue, and provided troops when they felt like it. Abbas systematically converts those tribal provinces into crown lands.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning he fires the tribal warlords and installs his own centralized bureaucrats.
Yeah.
The tax revenue stops going to the tribes and starts flowing directly into his personal royal treasury.
Okay, but if you cut off the warlords, you lose your army. How does he fight the Ottomans?
He builds a new one. With that direct influx of cash, Abbas creates a standing army, paid directly by the crown, loyal only to him.
Oh, wow.
And critically, he fills this army heavily with ghulams. These are enslaved Caucasians, Georgians, and Armenians who were converted to Islam and raised to serve the Shah. He equips them with firearms and artillery. He entirely neutralizes the Qizilbash monopoly on violence.
That is incredibly calculated. He doesn't just fight his rivals, he changes the underlying architecture of the state so his rivals have no leverage. And it wasn't just internal politics where he acted purely on strategy. I was reading this section in the notes about his global alliances, and it blew my mind. The 1622 capture of Hormuz.
Ah, yes. One of the most revealing geopolitical events of the era.
Let me set the scene for the listener, because this is wild. The Portuguese, a major European naval power, have controlled the island of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf for over a century. It's a massive choke point for global trade.
Right.
Shah Abbas wants it back. So what does this Muslim land-based empire do? They team up with the English East India Company, a European Christian naval power. They combine Safavid land forces with English ships to attack the Portuguese and take back the island.
Which perfectly shatters any simplistic modern notion we have of an East versus West or Muslim versus Christian historical binary. Power at this level does not care about ideology.
They had no permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests.
Exactly. Abbas recognized a pragmatic reality. He said, I have the troops, you have the ships. We both hate the Portuguese, let's make a deal. He weaponized European rivalries to serve Iranian interests.
Wait, looking at Abbas's strategy here, here's where it gets really interesting. This is exactly what your notes mean by the Devon profile, isn't it? This is the evolved Devon.
It's a flawless psychological mirror.
Ismail was the raw, unchecked impulse, the trauma response. But Shah Abbas is Devon at peak adaptation. He takes the generational trauma of the failure at Chalderan, and instead of repeating it, he replaces raw instinct with calculated, rigid systems.
He learns the lesson.
Right. He realizes you can't survive on zeal alone. You have to build a machine, and he builds it with terrifying efficiency.
But building that machine, funding a new standing army with firearms, centralizing a massive bureaucracy, it requires unimaginable wealth. A corporatized empire needs immense capital.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And to generate that cash flow, Shah Abbas made a highly effective but deeply ruthless economic move.
We have to talk about the human chessboard, the silk economy.
Silk was the petroleum of the early modern world. It was the ultimate glamour commodity. European demand for Iranian raw silk was insatiable. But to monetize that, Abbas didn't just let free markets operate.
No.
He established a royal monopoly. Every bale of silk had to go through his agents. He created a massive fiscal apparatus, tax rolls, journals, accounting registers, tracking village assessments across the entire empire.
But the mechanism of how he maximized this trade is where the history gets incredibly dark. The notes spend a lot of time on this. Between 1603 and 1604, during a war with the Ottomans, Shah Abbas ordered the deportation of the Armenians from their ancestral home in Julfa, which was right on the contested frontier.
We have to be clear about the sheer brutality of this event. This wasn't a requested migration. This was a scorched earth tactic. Abbas wanted to deprive the advancing Ottoman army of any supplies or shelter, so he systematically destroyed the towns in the Caucasus.
It's just devastating.
He forced tens of thousands of Armenians to march south across the Araxes River in the dead of winter. Thousands died of exposure, starvation, and drowning. It was a massive, coercive uprooting of a frontier population.
I'm reading this, and I'm just appalled, but then the notes pivot to what happened next, and I'm struggling to reconcile it. Because he doesn't just put them in camps. He forcibly relocates the survivors to his capital, Isfahan, and builds them a new, prosperous suburb called New Julfa.
Because he recognized their immense human capital. The Armenians of Julfa were already deeply embedded in regional trade networks. Abbas essentially looked at his imperial balance sheet and realized he needed elite merchants to manage his royal silk monopoly and sell it to Europe. So he repositioned them.
Like assets.
Literally like assets. He gave them religious freedom, autonomy, and interest-free loans to rebuild. And the Armenians of New Julfa responded by becoming one of the most spectacularly successful merchant diasporas in global history.
Oh.
They established trade family networks that stretched from London to Venice, all the way to India and Manila. They invented complex ledger systems and credit transfers that allowed a merchant in Isfahan to guarantee a payment in Amsterdam. They funneled an ocean of silver back into the Safavid treasury.
Which poses such a difficult question for you listening right now. How do we categorize this historically? Are the Armenians of New Julfa a triumph of diaspora resilience and success because they practically built the early modern global economy? Or are they a tragic case study in imperial exploitation and ethnic displacement?
This raises an important question, and it exposes the brutal logic of early modern power. They were both. An empire doesn't just conquer territory. It physically moves human beings across a map to optimize the state's survival.
Which, bringing it back to your framework, is the absolute darkest trait of the Devon personality.
Yes, exactly.
The willingness to utilize people. Treating human lives not as souls with inherent dignity, but as components in a system, cogs in a machine. It is breathtakingly efficient, but it strips away the humanity of the subjects in the name of the system's higher purpose.
It is control devoid of empathy. But that control produced profound, undeniable results. Because all of this wealth, all of this centralized power, and all of this strict administrative discipline was funneled into one physical space. The masterpiece of the empire.
Isfahan.
Shah Abbas moved the capital to Isfahan in 1598. And he didn't just build a city, he built a machine for living, trading, and ruling.
The sources describe the mechanics of Isfahan, and it is staggering. He builds the Nash-e-Jahan Square, which is one of the largest public squares in the world.
It's massive.
And it's not just big, it's spatially brilliant. On one side, you have the massive royal mosque representing religious authority. Opposite that, the royal palace representing the Shah. And at the head of the square, the monumental entrance to the imperial bazaar representing the economy. It's the entire blueprint of the Safavid state laid out in stone.
It was a monument to political theology. You have massive caravanserais, essentially combination hotels and warehouses for foreign merchants. You have public baths, theological colleges, and coffee houses.
Right, the coffee houses.
The coffee houses are fascinating because they became these vibrant social hubs where poets, merchants, and even the Shah himself would mingle, exchange news, and debate.
It totally shatters the stereotype of a restrictive, monochrome, religious autocracy. It was an intellectual, cosmopolitan metropolis humming with global languages.
But in the notes emphasize this heavily, we have to be careful not to view this through a modern democratic lens. Isfahan was diverse, yes, but diversity under an empire is not equality. It is extreme social stratification.
Let's break down that latter, because your experience of this golden age depended entirely on what rung you stood on.
At the very top, you have the Shah and the high court elite living in unimaginable luxury. Below them, the military commanders and the high-ranking religious scholars, the ulama, who controlled the judiciary and education. Then the wealthy merchant class, like our Armenian traders. Then the skilled artisans, the weavers, the miniaturists, the metal workers.
And at the bottom.
The massive foundation of peasant farmers and nomadic pastoralists who bore the crushing burden of the taxation required to build all these beautiful monuments and fund the armies. You were protected, and your community was tolerated only as long as you served a specific function for the imperial machine.
But the output of that machine, the culture they produced is still the global benchmark. The court patronage fostered an explosion of art. We're talking about illuminated manuscripts, incredibly detailed miniature paintings, intricate ceramics.
And the silk textiles, the Safavid carpets. These weren't just floor coverings. They were massive, woven prestige objects, meticulously designed in royal workshops and exported to the courts of Europe. They were a form of soft power.
I want to focus on the aesthetics of that art because it reveals something profound about the Safavid mind. The notes call their artistic style refinement with teeth.
I love that phrase.
Right. The art wasn't chaotic. It was obsessed with order, geometry, stylized gardens, and sacred monumentality. Even a scene of a violent royal hunt is painted with perfect, meticulous, almost peaceful precision.
Which is the final perfect connection to the psychology of Devon. A personality built on trauma and the fear of collapse cannot tolerate chaos, not even in its art.
Oh, that's so true.
The Safavids suppressed chaotic expression in favor of highly disciplined, structured beauty. They controlled the aesthetic environment just as ruthlessly as they controlled the political one. It is control made visible.
But here is the fatal flaw in the Devon profile and in the Safavid Empire. Systems built on sheer discipline and singular top-down control are incredibly strong, right up until the exact moment they aren't.
Because what happens when a system built on adaptation stops adapting?
It rots from the inside. And the fall of the Safavids wasn't a sudden out-of-the-blue catastrophe. It was a slow, agonizing decay followed by a swift kick.
We have to look at the mechanisms of this decline. After Shah Abbas dies in 1629, the system he built is so strong that it runs on autopilot for decades. But his successors begin to change the rules of the court.
Yeah, this part is wild.
To prevent rebellions, later Shahs stopped sending princes to the provinces to learn how to govern or fight. Instead, they locked them in the royal harem for their entire lives.
So when the old Shah dies, a guy who has never seen an army, never governed a town, and never left the palace is suddenly handed the keys to a massive global empire.
Exactly. The leadership becomes entirely disconnected from reality. Court eunuchs and factions start pulling the strings. The massive standing army that Abbas built goes unpaid and stagnates. The state becomes overly reliant on past systems. They inherited immense strength, but they lost the muscular memory of how to maintain it.
They became rigid. They traded adaptation for comfort. And history violently punishes rigidity. The external shock finally arrived in 1722.
The Afghan invasion by the Hotaki dynasty.
This is a devastating collapse. A relatively small force of Afghan rebels marches out of the eastern provinces. They defeat a much larger but disorganized Safavid army at the Battle of Gulnabad. Then they lay siege to the glittering capital of Isfahan.
The mechanics of this siege are horrifying.
The city is starved into submission. The sources mentioned people eating street dogs and eventually resorting to cannibalism. The Shah surrenders, and the empire shatters.
But as the notes make crystal clear, the Afghans didn't destroy the Safavid Empire. They just pushed over a hollow tree.
Yeah?
A healthy, adaptive empire does not collapse from a single frontier rebellion. The system had already failed internally.
Now, there is a brief postscript here. A successor tries to reboot the system. Nader Shah of the Afsharid dynasty rises from the chaos in the 1730s. He is a military genius. He drives out the Afghans, pushes back the Ottomans, and even invades India, sacking Delhi.
But Nader's Shah is the ultimate contrast to the state builders like Abbas. Nader wasn't a stabilizer. He was a brutal, paranoid shock reset. He tried to mandate stability through sheer, unrestrained violence. He could win battles, but he couldn't build a lasting civil administration. The empire fractured completely shortly after his assassination.
You cannot mandate a system into existence with a sword if the underlying social contract is broken. So the core autopsy of the Safavid Empire, it fell because it became rigid in a world that absolutely required constant dynamic adaptation.
As we look back over the entire life cycle of this staggering early modern empire, we have to return to the synthesis you asked for. We have to look in the Devon mirror one last time.
So what does this all mean? Let's map the psychology directly to the history.
It tracks perfectly across three distinct phases. First, you have Shah Ismail. He represents Devon's early volatility, the raw, unchecked response to the trauma of the geographic pressure cooker. He forges unity through sheer force, messianic identity, and unyielding conviction. He builds strength through damage.
Then you have Shah Abbas. He is Devon at peak capacity. Disciplined control, strategic sacrifice. Replacing raw instinct with highly calculated systems, he masters his environment, adapts after the trauma of Chaldiran, and builds the great machine of Isfahan.
And finally, you have the fall. This is the ultimate warning for the Devon personality profile. What happens when strength becomes so enamored with its own systems that it stops evolving?
It's a dangerous trap.
Exactly. The obsession with control turns into rigidity. The isolation from reality leads to blindness. And rigidity invariably leads to collapse.
It's a complete life cycle. But as I'm looking at your notes, one thing is glaringly obvious, and it challenges how we typically want to consume history. We want a simple story. We want the noble heroes and the evil villains.
What's fascinating here is that the history explicitly refuses to give us that comfort. There are no pure heroes or pure villains in the Safavid story. There are only people making incredibly high-stakes decisions with incomplete information in a brutal world.
They are constantly balancing ideology against pragmatism, unity against coercion, the survival of the state against the human consequence. Every hero in this story built something immensely valuable, but broke something profoundly human to do it. And every villain was often just operating within the cold, undeniable logic of survival.
The Safavids were impressive precisely because they were dangerous. They manufactured profound beauty, geopolitical coherence, and cultural resilience. But they also rationalized extreme cruelty, rigid conformity, and mass displacement. You cannot separate the architectural splendor of Isfahan from the coercion that funded it.
Which leaves us with their enduring legacy, because they didn't just fade away into dust. The notes outline 3 surviving pillars of the Safavid era that are still actively shaping the world right now.
Right.
First, the enduring Twelver Shiʿism religious identity of modern Iran. That wasn't a historical accident. It was an engineered Safavid policy, and it remains a defining geopolitical reality in the Middle East today. Second, the visual benchmark of classical Persian art. When you walk into a museum in London or New York today and look at the stunning tiles, the illuminated manuscripts, and the magnificent carpets, you are looking at an aesthetic decisively forged by the discipline of the Safavid court.
And third, they consolidated an unusually durable idea of Iranian statehood. They took a fractured, impossible geography and forged a unified political, religious, and territorial identity that survived centuries of subsequent turmoil and invasions. They built an ideological structure that completely outlasted their own dynasty.
Which leaves us with a lingering question. A provocation based on the very mechanisms we just spent an hour uncovering.
Lay it on us.
If the Safavids could literally manufacture an enduring, centuries-long national and religious identity through absolute top-down control, the forced relocation of populations, and the strategic repositioning of human lives in the 1500s, well, how much of our own modern national, cultural, or even personal identities today are actually just the inherited results of someone else's ruthless, long-forgotten strategic repositioning? Wow, we think we are standing on solid ground. We think we are looking at a clean, organic reflection of who we are and where we come from. But the reality is, we might just be living inside the borders someone else drew hundreds of years ago through sheer discipline and force. To you listening, thank you so much for bringing such an incredible multi-layered stack of sources to the table today. Keep questioning the structures around you, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.